May 1939. As tensions between the powers of Europe reach a breaking point and conflict seems inevitable, another crucial event takes place in the Far East: the battles of Khalkhin Gol. What begins as a small border conflict between Japan and the USSR quickly escalates into a full-fledged war that will leave almost 50,000 men dead or wounded. Although these battles would later be overshadowed in scale by the campaigns of World War II, these encounters are still pivotal in history, not because of their size, but because of how they would affect the conflicts and compromises that Japan would take after the war. In the 1930s, the Empire of Japan was following a policy of imperial expansion in Asia. In 1931, Japanese forces invaded Manchuria. In the years following this move, tensions on the 3,000-mile-long border of Japanese-controlled Manchuria and the Soviet Union would increase, and Japan would continue to aggressively push on in Asia. In 1936, Japan would sign the Anti-Comintern Pact with Germany, gaining German support and alarming the Soviet Union. As conflict with the Soviets increased, a faction in the Japanese High Command, known as the Strike North Group, gained popularity. This group had many proponents, including the Army General Kenkichi Ueda. Ueda argued that a strike on the Soviet Union would allow Japan to gain resources in Mongolia and Siberia, which would be used to defeat China. The views of the Strike North Group increased tension in the region, and in May of 1939, a small border skirmish between Mongolian and Manchurian forces gave the Strike North Group an excuse to begin war with the USSR. The battles of Khalkhin Gol had begun. These battles would last nearly 5 months and involve nearly 150,000 men. As the war went on, however, Japanese forces began to lose ground. In August of 1939, the Soviets signed the Soviet-German Non-Aggression Pact with Germany. At the same time, they launched a massive tank attack against Japanese forces, pushing the Japanese back. Betrayed by a major ally, and with its forces in retreat, Japan was left with no choice but to surrender. On September 16th, Japan signed a ceasefire with the Soviet Union, conceding territory and agreeing to Soviet terms. The battles of Khalkhin Gol were relatively minor engagements when compared to the campaigns that would come later in World War II. Despite this, these battles still played an enormous role in the course of world history because of how they would affect Japan's actions. Because of the battles of Khalkhin Gol, Japanese leaders were forced to change their strategy. Instead of choosing conflict in the north with the Soviet Union and Mongolia, Japan would choose conflict in the Pacific Ocean and Southwest Asia.
There was a very intense rivalry between the Japanese Navy and the Japanese Army, but then when the Japanese Army is defeated by the Soviets at Khalkhin Gol, the conclusion is we can't have this land war with the Soviet Union, and so the Japanese Navy then goes into the driver's seat. Japanese policy is then redirected toward expansion towards Southeast Asia.
Japanese leaders sought to control oil reserves in the Dutch East Indies, as well as in Indochina and the Philippines. Thus, in 1941, Japan advanced into southern French-controlled Indochina, prompting conflict with the Western powers such as the United States and Great Britain.
The main thing was the United States, and Britain for that matter, were opposed to Japanese aggression. And so as a way to try to dissuade the Japanese from any further aggressive moves, the U.S. policy was to try to put economic sanctions on the Japanese.
Because of this conflict, on July 26, 1941, 2 days after the Japanese occupation of Indochina, the United States froze Japanese assets. A short while later, on August 1st, the U.S. established an embargo on oil exports to Japan. These moves caused a crisis in resource-poor Japan and led to further conflict. On December 7, 1941, as compromises with the United States failed and war seemed inevitable, Japan launched a surprise attack, assaulting Pearl Harbor and various other U.S. and British bases in the Pacific Islands. The United States was pulled into World War II. The battles of Khalkhin Gol, a small border skirmish between Japan and the Soviet Union, had changed Japan's entire military strategy, placed the United States in the crosshair of Japanese aggression, and changed the course of World War II forever. Because of the battles of Khalkhin Gol, Japan chose conflict with the United States and other Western powers in the Pacific. However, the battles of Khalkhin Gol also led Japan to choose compromise. On April 13, 1941, Japan signed the Japanese-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact with the Soviet Union, a direct result of the border war that took place nearly 2 years ago. Japanese leaders had numerous reasons for signing the treaty with the Soviets. After the battles of Khalkhin Gol, Japan needed its border in Manchuria secure so that more troops could be moved in the Pacific, where Japan's aggression was now focused. In addition, Japan did not want to be defeated by the Soviets again, who now had a far greater amount of firepower in the region than the Japanese did. The signing of the Japanese-Soviet Neutrality Pact had far-reaching consequences in World War II. On June 22, 1941, German forces invaded the Soviet Union. German leaders encouraged the Japanese to avenge their defeat at Khalkhin Gol and attack the Soviets, splitting them on 2 fronts. But the Japanese honored their compromise with the Soviets and chose not to attack. Once again, there were many reasons behind Japan's actions. Japan's resources were committed to fighting the United States, and the Japanese could not afford a war with the Soviets. In addition, the Japanese had few troops in Manchuria and would have trouble invading Siberia. The most important reason, however, was summed up by Eugene Ott, the German ambassador to Japan, who noted, "In my reports, I have repeatedly pointed out that after the experiences at Khalkhin Gol, the army activists consider participation in the war against the Soviet Union too risky and too unprofitable."
The Japanese never wanted to tangle with the Soviet Union again in a land war. And as a result of that, Japan would not join in the invasion of the Soviet Union when the Germans attacked in 1941. So that's a key thing.
This was one of the most important legacies of the battles of Khalkhin Gol. Japanese leaders, haunted by their defeat to the Soviets, chose to compromise with, instead of attack, the Soviet Union, even during the darkest days of its invasion by Germany. The battles of Khalkhin Gol are referred to by many as history's forgotten wars. Overshadowed by campaigns in World War II, the battles of Khalkhin Gol are not as well known. However, these minor battles affected World War II, perhaps even more than Stalingrad or Kursk. These battles laid the foundations for Japan's conflicts and compromises in World War II, setting Japan on the course for both Pearl Harbor and the Japanese-Soviet Neutrality Pact. In the end, the legacy of the battles of Khalkhin Gol continues to affect Russian-Japanese relations today and will continue to affect the world for years to come.